Thank you, everybody, for coming out. This is really exciting to have everybody here. As Oscar said, I'm going to be mainly focusing on intergroup dialogue as one intervention in conflict. The origins of the paper that will be a chapter in a new book coming out and this presentation is, of course, that we're still faced with many conflicts around things such as race, gender, economic status in our society, and these are rooted in unequal power. As I said, intergroup dialogue is one intervention, and a lot of people use the term dialogue kind of loosely. Often in everyday speech, it just means talking to each other. But we're talking about a very specific form of speaking to one another. Actually, there are many forms of dialogue, and I'm going to mainly speak about intergroup dialogue as it is performed here at SU in the Intergroup Dialogue Program. But a lot of the principles are translatable to many different kinds of conflicts. And I just want to throw in a quote from Cornel West, who says, "Dialogue is about struggle. It is not just chit-chat." So he agrees with us on that one. As Oscar mentioned, I have been struck by the really great potential of intergroup dialogue, but I feel that it's extremely important to take into account the critiques that are made around dialogue. And so this has developed from those critiques. The term intractability comes originally from this book, Lou Kreisberg, who is here if you don't know him. Lou and Terrell Northrup and Stuart Thorson wrote this book in 1989, which became kind of a jumping off point for a lot of research on conflict resolution and conflict transformation. And this new collection is a kind of a 30th anniversary collection. And in this original book, this quote is from the foreword by Elise Boulding, who says there are no unresolvable conflicts, only conflicts in which the parties stubbornly resist solutions. And those of you who have dealt with any kind of conflict can imagine both the stubborn resistance and some of the techniques that we try to overcome that. So just to introduce myself a little bit more, I've co-facilitated dialogues here at SU, as Oscar mentioned, some of the people in the room. I have worked to bring dialogue to larger audiences through conferences and events like this. And I'm also very involved in the community around peace and social justice. Much of my focus is on anti-nuclear social movements. And as I do that work, I recognize more and more how that is rooted in domination. Imagine, they're about the ultimate in domination, right? And so the solidarity with people who are marginalized by these processes and other processes of domination in society are very connected with that. And I have been involved with dialogues in the community as well. So I have brought together some different literatures of areas that are already interdisciplinary. Conflict resolution certainly is, as is intergroup dialogue. And I'm defining intergroup dialogue in its specific form, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But I bring out the critiques and also the strategies in intergroup dialogue to address those critiques. And actually, just remember that I brought something with me which I wanted to hand out, because if anybody wants to jot down a few notes and doesn't have a large pad of paper, you could use this, and then you have also the web address of the Intergroup Dialogue Program. Jacob's laughing at me.
That's great branding.
There we go. So one sort of foundational piece out of many that we can trace both of these literatures to is Alport's contact theory. Basically the idea that if people get together, they're less likely to be in conflict. And Alport suggests 4 different requirements for that lack of conflict or for that compatibility to grow. One of them is equal status. But as we know, so many of the conflicts we deal with do not deal with equal status, with participants of equal status. And therefore, there's been a lot of research done as to what do we do when the parties are not of equal status. One of the things I thought was important to emphasize here is that the Intergroup Dialogue Program at SU deals with small groups of students, many dialogues in the community, and many that have been researched through both this dialogue research that was done around our program and 10 other universities, as well as a lot of other research on dialogues has been done with community dialogues, not necessarily international ones. And so sometimes the sense is, well, yeah, that's nice. It's nice for little groups of people to come together and be nice to each other. But what I was doing with these next couple of slides is showing some of the ways in which people have really made clear that dialogue can be a piece of building block towards larger conflict resolution. So I'll just, I don't have to read these out to you. I want to point out my good friend Bertha Amici, who is one of the authors who shows how civil society has been important in conflict transformation in a number of communities in Africa as well. And a quote from Lou Kreisberg, not just from the top down, but from the bottom up and laterally. And this is also a quote from the original book that I pointed out. Richard Schwartz says that grassroots dialogue can affect high-level decision-making, including government policy. So I just think it's important to point those facts out before jumping into the critiques. So one important critique that is definitely often seen is that dialogue can maintain or reinscribe oppressive power relations. I've been in community dialogues in which, in workplaces, in which the boss is in the room along with the participants. That's going to create some situations which maybe can be dealt with, maybe can be used to advantage, but needs absolutely to be taken into account. Or police community dialogues, where there's a huge power differential that can just get reinforced unless some very careful strategizing takes place, and certainly can't go without being spoken about. Classroom dialogues, right? We grade our students. So we need to talk about how are we grading them. We're not grading them on the struggles that they have. Those are something that we think is very positive when they're working on the struggles around these identities. But we're grading them on their engagement and participation and really grappling with these issues. But that, again, has to be talked about. Another concern about dialogue is that in many instances, friendship is kind of the core, and or getting along. Some of the Yatzbak, Abu Ahmad, Bessel et al. Also talk about coexistence dialogues. And many dialogues are geared in that way just to get along. But that can obscure the fact that what's really needed is the political change. tokenizing and colonizing. And some of these critiques come from the very people, Guran, Nagda, and Zuniga, for example, who have developed the Intergroup Dialogue Program and who believe very deeply in it. So they are pointing out, again, the risks of some dialogues if we're not conscious of what we're doing, kind of focusing on cultural artifacts, but not talking about the socio-political contexts. I don't know, how many of you have heard and grappled with the term normalization? Is that something pretty common? Okay, so a number of people have thought about this already. This started, to me at least, it started becoming something talked about just a few years ago. I hadn't heard it before that. But certainly this is an extremely important concept. Just assuming that these relations of domination, whether it's about gender or race, etc., are just normal and not even talking about them, not even looking at the power asymmetries, and basically accepting the status quo. And, even when the power asymmetries are pointed out, if nothing is done about that, that can be problematic. Gretchen?
Is normalization just homogenization, or how are you defining it?
Keeping privilege invisible. It's basically making it seem like the privilege is just the way it is. Does that help a little more? And I've had people say in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict, if we don't resist the occupation, we are normalizing. That's one of the places that I first heard this concept, and I struggle with that a bit because I feel it's certainly it's a goal that I have to resist the occupation, but if you go into a dialogue with the idea that you have a particular outcome that may not be common among all the participants, you may be setting yourself up for failure. Whereas if everyone can bring their own concerns and issues into the dialogue, there's much more opportunity to come to a common understanding. So I just wanted to bring up Lederach, and of course conflict transformation was being brought up long before that. In fact, it's part of the context of this collection from 1989. But he talks about how in Latin America in the 80s, some people were really suspicious of him going in there and saying, well, we're going to solve these problems through conflict resolution. And people would say, yeah, but if you are just about quick solutions, maybe things will be okay for a while, but it's going to break out in other ways and it doesn't really change the underlying structures. And so it was just another way to cover up the changes that are really needed. So he put a lot of attention towards conflict transformation, as have a number of other people since this book came out. So now I'm getting to intergroup dialogue, and I want to give some definitions of what this program, which, as I mentioned, it was part of a research project with 10 universities, most of which, I think all but one of which, still has programs in intergroup dialogue, including SU. So some of the key factors are the face-to-face. Can't be, it's not an online course, right? Gotta be face-to-face. And the different identities are along a variety of different lines depending on the particular topic. So race and ethnicity, socioeconomic inequality, gender, and so forth. But all are intersectional. So all of those identities come up whichever dialogue is being taught, but there's a particular focus on a smaller area. And they have to be sustained. They have to be over a period of time. So our 3-credit course is over a full semester. And there's a very strong emphasis on the social inequalities and the working together towards resolving some of the issues that come between people of those identities. So it starts with low-risk activities and moves to high risk. It starts with interpersonal, but moves to institutional, and definitely moves in the direction of action and includes an action project I'll talk about in a bit. Power relations are central. The experience of students is very important and is brought into the classroom. Experience and emotions, right? All of these things are brought into the classroom in ways that many classrooms don't bring these things in. But those are quite central to intergroup dialogue. Developing guidelines collaboratively so that the whole idea of having shared power in the classroom gets discussed in the very early stages. And we talk about, instead of talking about safe spaces, we talk about safer spaces because we want to encourage risk-taking. And we know that some people never feel completely safe in the classroom. And we need to be talking about that and aware of that and still trying to make it as safe as possible. Small classes, trust is key, and different identities, right? So multiple identities. Says equal numbers of identities, but that's never really realistic because there's so many different combinations and permutations, but multiple identities. And this term multi-partiality is something that I'll keep coming back to. I think it's one of the keys here. We hear so much about impartiality, right? But we feel it's extremely important to have multi-partiality. In other words, there is no one sort of God's eye view, one factual reality that cannot be contested, but we all see things in so many different ways depending on the experiences that we've had, the identities we have, the way our group is treated as a group, and so multi-partiality is extremely important. So there are 4 stages, starting with communication skills and trust building, moving into some of the sociology of social structures. Then comes really using those skills as we discuss hot topics. And then the collaborative projects, which start at the very beginning, but are much more of the focus towards the end of the semester. So some of the skills are things that you know about. Certainly active listening is commonly understood, but we also think about how the sender formulates the message and really work hard to be clear in how we send the messages. And we talk about giving feedback and checking out, did I understand that you said such and such? Those are additional skills that we go into. Also distinguishing personal identities, just, I'm a nice person. I like music or, all of those kinds of things, from the social identities that are both the way we identify ourselves in social groups and the way we're perceived in social groups. So in this stage, students share their personal stories of being a person of their identity. And trust and risk-taking are both important. So then we come to a level where we're starting to talk about the institutional structures and beginning to really recognize the way that power operates and the way identities and institutions interact. Now, I don't know how well you can see this photo, but we use an actual, it's it's a Halloween web made of string, but we put on it cards with statistics and data that show various ways in which different groups experience marginalization. And they're organized into categories based on institutions. So things about women in the media, or crime and race, and all those different areas that and so we look at the intersections of these things and see the patterns that take place. Another thing that happens in this phase of dialogue is that we break into smaller groups by identity, and many of the students come in saying, well, I'm in an intergroup dialogue and I just made friends with everybody, and now you're separating us. What is this about? And there's actually sometimes some pretty strong emotion around that. And but as we have conversations in those separate groups, students begin to see how they actually speak differently when they're with people of their identity as compared to when they're in larger groups, mixed groups. And then we can begin to analyze the power relationships and challenge one another when we come back into the larger group. So this, I think this quote just emphasizes ways of exercising and sharing power are analyzed. Understand the nature of power, how it gets tied to social identity, and what they might work towards in terms of equalizing power. So that's the goal of breaking up into these small groups and then coming back and sharing together. I think sometimes the clearest the clearest place where we begin to see the actual power dynamics is when we're discussing these controversial topics. And we see who speaks, who talks over other people, who feels free to represent a whole group of people, who claims a certain kind of authority that says that they can name what it is that is going on, even if someone else sees it differently. But if we're taking that apart, we can name that and see how the power is operating. Also, looking at dominant versus counter narratives, and we speak a lot about counter narratives. We start that in the beginning when they tell their stories, because they're speaking their own truth, which is sometimes very different from the norm, so sometimes very different from what they would read in mainstream news and so forth, and how they see themselves represented. So counter narratives are really important, and talking about what narratives are sometimes missing.
Could you just give a couple examples of what hot topics were brought up?
Sure. Let's see. Well, affirmative action is often a key one in race dialogues. In the, I think the hottest topic that I've experienced was in the socioeconomic dialogue when we talked about charter schools. And that was very kind of conflictual, and it got a lot of emotion going. Partly because some of the students had been in charter schools and other of the students were highly critical of them. So that made it a really good topic for this purpose. And then action projects which are aimed to work across identities and build alliances. And I love this term, co-resistance. So Yatzbach and Abu Ahmad and all of that long list of authors talk about coexistence dialogues versus co-resistance dialogues. So the critique that dialogue can be just about friendship and about getting along, they counter with co-resistance. Another thing that we do is look at models of social justice action. And then the students actually create their own action or participate in one that's actually going on already on campus. And they need to learn to match a strategy to the problem. And we often find that these projects increase their sense of efficacy and increase their commitment to future action, both their hope in future action and their desire to do so. The written assignments, the readings and written assignments are in order to put this in a bigger context. We like to have classes that are in the range of anywhere from 12 to 18 students, small but enough diversity that they hear different stories from each other. But there's still a limit in that, right, in what they'll hear and what identities are represented. So we put them in a larger context with the readings and, of course, the analysis that these authors come up with. Again, I mentioned before the concept of multi-partiality, and that is very important in the facilitation of dialogue, to have facilitators who identify with different identities and who are making the space for these counter narratives that I spoke of. And pardon me for looking at the clock, but I want to make sure there's time for, oh great, for discussion around this after I'm done. So I think I'm doing okay so far. I'm not going to go into detail about the research, but suffice it to say, there has been and continues to be a lot of research around intergroup dialogue. The 9 university research that we participated in over a period of 3 years, it did talk about intergroup understanding and relationships, which are the sort of coexistence part, but it also got into the collaboration and engagement successes in that area, which is more like the co-resistance piece. So according to that 5-year project, dialogue was shown to produce consistent positive effects across those outcomes. Increased awareness about structural power, and this is one of the hardest things I think we try to do in the dialogue classes. The interpersonal stuff is easy for them to get, but the structural awareness is much more difficult. And this Dessel and Rogi study in 2008 took a lot of different dialogues, both academic and community level dialogues. So this was sort of a generalization from that. Interest in participating in politics and civic life. So I think the practice engaging difference is really key, and challenging institutional discrimination. And I must say that comes out in their college careers. There have been a number of our students back in 3 years ago with the general body. A number of our dialogue students were very involved in that. One of our dialogue students came back to give one of the keynote presentations at the opening of the Lender Center. So they tend to get involved in challenging institutions and develop confidence in taking action. And that latter example is one small example of the carryover. So I just want to summarize some of the ways that the Intergroup Dialogue Program addresses the critiques that I brought up. It does very centrally to the process, exposes power. It emphasizes multi-partiality, illustrates counter-narratives, emphasizes action, alliances, and solidarity, and disrupts the coexistence or friendship analysis that ignores power and instead replaces the coexistence form with co-resistance. So working together to create change to resist the inequalities in society. And I will just mention that there's a long bibliography here, and if anyone is interested in these sources or in any of the presentation, I would be glad to share that. So maybe we can leave out a sheet so that people could sign a list with your email if you would like to get a copy. So yeah, Catherine.
So thank you, this was really great.